Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm Jennifer Bachner. I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics here at Johns Hopkins University. We host this forum about every other month along with REI Systems to bring together Johns Hopkins students and faculty along with leaders in government industry to talk about how analytics are being used in the public sector to advance decision making. I just have a few programming notes before I turn the mic over to Jeff, who will introduce our speaker. We very much encourage audience participation, and there'll be a substantial block of time after the speaker for audience questions. And if you're joining us via the live stream, we very much encourage you to ask questions as well, and I believe there's a place right below the video where you can post your questions. We also encourage you to connect with us on social media. You can tweet us at #GAB Forum, so please do that. That's all I have, so thanks again for joining us, and I will turn the program over to Jeff Myers of REI Systems.
First, I want to describe our real interest here is to try and help create and build a community around analytics. So our hope is that you not only actually ask questions of Norm, but you talk with each other as well, so that we can have all of us become better at addressing government problems and using analysis and using evidence in decision making. REI is sponsoring this in part because REI does a bunch of analytics work, but also for a variety of other reasons. We're interested in hiring folks who are good analysts. We're interested in getting a better understanding ourselves of the challenges that agencies face that analysis can help, and we're interested, frankly, in learning good ideas from wherever they may come. Just as a kind of a bit of background, we had a program such as this every other month last year, and we'll continue this year. This morning I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, but I want to give you a heads up now that on October 30th there will be a presentation similarly, another government analytics breakfast by the OMB Director of Personnel and Performance Management. And as well, I want to make the first public announcement, that REI is also helping launch a grants management breakfast, similarly oriented towards a kind of a different community, but similarly the same sort of format. So a presenter from the government will be coming. And what I found is unusual is that most folks who say grants management typically mean, how can I receive more grants? How can I make sure they're used well? Our perspective will be different. It will be 20% or more of the government's civilian spending goes out in the form of grants. And so our perspective will be, how can government agencies get better results for the grants they make? How can they be more efficient in making them? And similarly, to kind of try and build a community about how can we learn from each other to be more effective in using government money and in achieving the purposes and the missions that the government agencies set out to achieve. But with no further ado, let me introduce a long-term friend of mine, Norman Dong. Norman is the Commissioner of the Public Building Service. Previously, he served as Deputy Mayor and Administrator for the City of the District of Columbia, as well as the Chief Financial Officer of FEMA, as well as the Comptroller of the Office of Management Budget here. Norman has responsibilities, you might guess, at PBS for a large amount of federal building space, 378 million square feet, housing more than 1 million employees, with a sizable budget. And in fact, one of the reasons you might imagine that we've asked Norm here is because there's a lot of data available from those sources, but it's also something where that data is not necessarily always just used, as you might imagine, for the efficiency and utilization of the buildings, but also for energy utilization, for spending, and as well, of course, for customer service needs. One of the kind of entertaining facts about Norm is that he is going to try and reach different baseball stadiums around the United States in just about every vacation when the baseball season is in play. Norm has, in terms of background, a bachelor's degree from Yale University and a master's degree from the Kennedy School of Government. So let me thank you very much, Norm, for coming to talk to us about the executive perspective on analytics and their use at the Public Building Service.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Very nice to be here. It's nice to see some old friends and some familiar faces. Wanted to take a moment to thank Jeff Myers and the team from REI for inviting me, as well as the team from Johns Hopkins who made this event possible this morning. Wanted to start off by sharing a few more facts and figures on what we do within the public building service. Jeff started to talk about the scale of our work. As Jeff said, there's more than 378 million square feet of workspace that we manage within the public building service, and that falls across about 8,700 owned or leased assets that we're responsible for. And among those, there are about 480 historic buildings that are either listed in or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So I think we are, if I have my data correct, I think we're the largest real estate management organization in the nation. And when I think about the work that we do within the public building service, it's all about helping meet the space requirements of our tenant agencies, but doing it in the most fiscally responsible way. So for us, it's a balancing act. There's a support role that we play in terms of meeting those real property requirements, but there's also a financial stewardship role where we need to make sure that we're protecting taxpayer interests as we manage the government's real property portfolio. Wanted to do a little bit of scene setting in terms of the fiscal climate and talk a little bit about the Federal Buildings Fund and how it's supposed to work. It's a quasi-revolving fund where we charge our tenant agencies rent, whether they are in owned space or leased space. We charge them market rent. And the logic is that all the dollars that we collect from our tenant agencies in rent should be reinvested back into our federal buildings portfolio, where we can use those funds to construct new buildings, to maintain or repair existing buildings, as well as meet our lease obligations in the private leasing work that we do. However, what we spend against the Federal Buildings Fund and the rent that we collect is set by congressional appropriation as opposed to every dollar that we collect. So what you're seeing is that we're collecting X amount of dollars, but we are only allowed to spend a subset of X back on the federal buildings portfolio. And what that means is that we're seeing a significant backlog of maintenance and repairs across the federal buildings portfolio, which is even more pronounced as our portfolio is aging. So I think that kind of underscores the fiscal challenges that we have. And for us within PBS, given the tight fiscal environment that we're working in, the question is, how are we making sure that we're managing every dollar effectively? And as we talk about data analytics, I think it's critically important to really identify how we're doing in terms of how well we're doing in terms of on that question of effectiveness, but also on that question of efficiency. And I'll share some examples this morning, and I will start off by saying some of the things that we're doing are not very sophisticated. Some of the stuff is real basic, but we're still doing it where we had not done it before, and I'll give a couple examples. Some of the things that we're doing a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more advanced, but I think you'll see a range of different types of data analytics that we're bringing to bear through this process. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the whole focus on not just freezing the footprint, but reducing the footprint. And some of you may be familiar with the directives that came out from OMB back in 2012. It was all about freezing the footprint. But we recognize that there's more opportunity, and it's not just stay level pegging where you were in fiscal year 12. It really is, what are the opportunities that you see across your portfolio to actually reduce your footprint? And the headline for all of us, and I think there's much more of a shared recognition today, that dollars, excess dollars that we spend on rent come at the expense of more mission critical activities. And the example that I like to give is back when I was on the tenant side. I was working at FEMA, and OMB had just cut our budget by a significant amount, and we were faced with the prospect of reducing staff. And in talking with the administrator, we said, you know, that's a non-starter for us. If our emergency management mandate is based on our ability to help communities respond to and recover from disaster, how can we be reducing our bench strength? Because that compromises our ability to do that. So we said, all right, we're not going to cut staff. Let's look at where else we are spending. And we saw that we were spending a significant chunk of change on rent, particularly in the National Capital Region where we had 11 different facilities for FEMA. So what we did was we actually reached out to GSA at the time and we said, look, we know we're spending too much on rent. We're not sure exactly how we should go about reducing our rent. Can you help us? What they did in a few short months was they looked at the 11 different locations we had in the National Capital Region, saw how well we were utilizing our space, saw that there was a significant opportunity for co-location and consolidation and reducing the footprint. And through that process, FEMA was able to save $10 million just in the National Capital Region. So I think that, for me personally, was very eye-opening in terms of recognizing that those dollars that we were spending on rent were competing with other dollars that would have supported more mission-critical activities. So it's that same type of logic that we're trying to embrace more broadly across the government as we work with agencies to reduce their footprint. So wanted to just take a moment to explain this chart. You'll see in 2012, the government-wide baseline was about 730.2 million, to be exact, square feet of space across all of the government. And you'll see, since then, a modest reduction. I think it's about $21 million, 21 million square feet that has been reduced over the past few years. So I think that is some good initial progress. But for us, it's not just kind of managing at the aggregate level. The question is, all right, if we want to go further, how do we actually look at this? And what we saw was that when you look at individual transactions, there really was no shared understanding of what that yardstick should be in terms of how you would scope out a particular facility given the number of people that would be in that facility. There was no explicit discussion of a space utilization standard, whereas in the private sector, that's very common. So what we've tried to do is to have a little bit more explicit conversation about what that space standard should be, knowing that it's one size fits all. You know, the Department of Homeland Security has very different requirements than OMB, which has very different requirements than the Department of Labor. So how do we not apply a one-size-fits-all approach, but allow a little bit more flexibility for the agencies to define what they think is important and then manage to that? So the issue was, within GSA, we had no visibility or transparency in terms of the number of people that would occupy any particular space. And when we talked about trying to be a little bit more rigorous and disciplined in this approach, there's a lot of pushback saying, oh, we don't have that information, I don't know how I'm going to get that information, it's a systems problem, I can't collect that information. If I hear it's a systems problem one more time, I don't tell you what I'll do. But to me, that's often the crutch that people rely upon. It's a systems problem. And that's your get out of jail free card for having to solve the problem. So we pushed back and we said, it's all about counting people. So as we get a new space requirement from the agency, what's the yardstick that we think would be relevant? And how is the space transaction doing relative to that yardstick? And you'll see that we've actually made some good progress in terms of creating a very basic infrastructure for beginning to look transaction by transaction to see how well we're performing on that question of space utilization. So here we use a notional number of 150 square feet, which is pretty reasonable when you look across the federal landscape in terms of what agencies are doing in terms of defining a space standard. And what we do now within GSA is every time we get a new lease requirement or a new requirement to be in federally owned space, we actually begin to count the number of people that would be in that space, look at the overall footprint, and then ask the question, is it a reasonable amount of space? So here it's all about the process discipline that was lacking before. We didn't have any visibility in terms of the number of people going into the space. We didn't have any way of saying, yeah, it's too much space or it's not enough space. But by being able to do something simple like counting the number of people that would be in the space and applying what we would think is a relevant yardstick, we're now able to see how well we're doing on that question of space utilization. So I think this, as we apply greater process discipline transaction by transaction, what we're hoping is that you'll see a more significant reduction as we go forward. So I wanted to switch gears and talk about leasing for a moment. And there's been a lot of conversation government-wide about the overall footprint and the number of square feet that we have. To me, what's equally important is the cost of that footprint, and where we have an ability to really influence that cost is in our leasing activity. And what we've seen in the past is agencies, when they're in lease space, they like to stay in place. And sometimes lease space is better than owned space. I see my colleague Ed Johnson from FEMA in the back. Ed and I worked at 395 E Street, Patriots Plaza. That was a nice, bright building. And I'm like, oh, this is nice. I could be here for a while. And what happens is when you get that I can be here for a while mindset, people want to stay in place. And when you stay in place and you send a strong signal to the landlord that you are comfortable staying in place, what's going to happen to the price?
Goes up.
Yep. So what we're trying to do is to break that mentality of I'm going to stay here for the next 20 years, for the next 40 years, and to really make sure that we are maximizing the government's leverage as it relates to our leasing transactions, and to really capitalize on what we see as favorable market rates in many localities. It's still a buyer's market here in DC and in other markets. But if we're sending a message to the landlord that, hey, we're good, guess what? We're leaving money on the table. So part of this is how do we inject a little bit more competition into the process? How do we be more disciplined in terms of working with agencies to get their requirements early enough, work with agencies to plan for a more competitive process so that we are leaving no stone unturned in terms of figuring out where we can get the best deal. So this chart actually, I think, makes my point, where what you see are different types of lease transactions, and you'll see that the more competitive approaches are new leases, replacing leases, superseding leases. The less competitive approaches are succeeding leases, renewals, or extensions. And the way you read this chart is you've got what the market rate would be versus what the GSA rate is. And you'll see the delta between the two. And you'll see because of the buying power of GSA, we're often able to get good rates. But if you look at those that are in the category of that are more competitive relative to those that are less competitive, you'll see that correlation I was talking about in terms of when we're taking a more competitive approach, we're getting a far better deal. So with replacing leases, we're doing 25% better than market. With superseding leases, we're doing about 17%. However, if you look at renewals or extensions, those are the least favorable relative to market. So what we're trying to do is, again, to work with our tenant agencies to say, we're going to meet your space requirement, but let's do so in the most fiscally responsible way. And to simply send a strong message to the market that we're hunkering down for the next 20 years and charge us whatever you want is not the right way to go. So, and I think I found this chart eye-opening when our team did the analysis. All right, I want to switch gears, talk about my favorite topic, janitorial contracts. All right, we spent a lot of money on operations and maintenance for the buildings in our portfolio. And we actually had a goal this year, and that was to reduce our O&M costs by $30 million without compromising service and support. So it's easy to go cut service, and then you'll see the corresponding tenant impact when we stop cleaning the bathrooms or washing the windows. But what we challenged the team to do is to say, hey, we recognize that there's some opportunity for efficiency across all the contracts that support our buildings. What do we do to actually capitalize on those opportunities for efficiency and bring down the price without de-scoping the work or without compromising support? So our folks who in the Great Lakes region in Chicago did some interesting analysis where they looked at the level of effort that we have in our contracts for specific buildings in the Great Lakes region relative to the total square footage in that building. And you would expect to see a fairly linear relationship between the two, where the bigger the building, the greater the number of hours required to clean that building. And what you're seeing as they ran the regression is that you've got some outliers there where the level of effort was actually far greater than what you would have expected. And I think the ones that we're looking there, you can see the Milwaukee Courthouse, the building at 536 South Clark in Chicago. You've got the Battle Creek Federal Building in Battle Creek, and then also the Bean Center in Indianapolis. And I wanted to take a moment just to talk a little bit about what was going on in Milwaukee. And the comparison indicated that the direct labor hours for the Milwaukee Courthouse were trending about 10,000 more hours than would have been anticipated. And adjusting the man hours to be in alignment would produce direct labor savings about $140,000 each year, which is actually close to what we were able to negotiate there. So this type of simple analysis showed us where things were out of whack, where the level of effort didn't correspond to the size of the building. And being able to do this type of simple analysis helped us pinpoint those opportunities for improvement. All right, switching gears, talking about daily gas consumption. And I like this case study, which looks at another building in Chicago where gas usage was increasing steadily, and the operations staff were saying, oh, it's because of the weather. And let me explain the chart. What you see is the blue data points are from 1 year. The red data points are from the following year. And you're seeing that there's a relationship between gas consumption and temperature. As the temperature goes down, gas consumption goes up. But when consumption started to increase in that second year, and folks were saying it's all about the weather, well, we found out it wasn't all about the weather when we did this type of analysis. And when we dug deeper, we saw that there was something else going on. And the analysis allowed GSA to effectively challenge the operator's claim, prompting further investigation, which revealed equipment and maintenance deficits that were causing the increase. So once we were able to address those equipment issues, we saw consumption go down. So again, some simple analysis being able to correlate temperature to gas consumption where we're able to better identify the source of the problem. All right, one more slide on energy, and I wanted to take a moment just to talk about our GSA Link program. And some of you may be familiar with what we're doing at GSA, where we have smart building technology called GSA Link, which is a cloud analytics program which allows us to use building analytics to monitor each facility individually and across all of our assets system-wide. We have it in about 81 of our buildings across all 11 regions, covering about 45 million square feet. And right now we're collecting about 27 million data points each day. And wanted to share a case study. Is this one? I think this one is, I forget which city this is in. But what this shows is daily energy consumption between December 20th, 2011 and January 4th, 2012. And you can see December 25th, or I'm sorry, Christmas was actually on a Sunday that day, so the building was closed on Monday the 26th, and then you can see the consumption day by day. But what strikes you as odd about the pattern that you see on that chart?
be the same as when the building's closed as when it's operating.
Yep. So somehow on December 26th, the federal holiday, all systems were go and everything was going full bore when nobody was in the building. But as we saw this information and saw, oh my, somebody left everything on December 26th, we said, all right, let's not make that mistake again for New Year's. So what you see as we get into the New Year's period, what happened? We turned off the system. So again, some simple information that is showing us how we're consuming energy and helps us inform our activities going forward. All right, this very busy slide actually helps us focus on project delivery. We've got thousands of projects within the Public Building Service. Some of them are large capital construction projects. Many more of them are smaller repair and alteration projects that are very important to our tenant agencies. And what we've seen is that we, in the past, didn't have a good visibility on how we were doing across the landscape. First, in terms of obligating our dollars and making contract awards, but then second, once we've actually made the contract award, how are we doing in terms of performing on schedule and on budget? And what we've been able to do over time is to develop what we call this data to decisions platform, or D2D, and this helps give us visibility on much more of the project activity landscape across GSA. And it pulls from multiple, in the past you'd have to pull from multiple systems and do a lot of, use a lot of brute force to pull it all together to be able to have that common operating picture. But through this D2D platform, we're able to pull it all together. So, this section down here shows how we're obligating our dollars relative to plan. The graphs up here allow us to see how we're doing in terms of on schedule and on budget. And the way that the system is set up is that you can drill down into any part of the geography within the PBS portfolio. Am I missing anything in terms of what this allows us to do, Greg?
It's a very dynamic report that allows you to click any area, any state, any fiscal year, and it will automatically update the data. It's probably one of our most advanced reports, and like the commissioner said, it is pulling information from multiple systems, which was never possible before.
And I think where this came to be very important was through the Recovery Act, where several years ago when we launched that project activity, we had to track roughly 270 major ARA projects worth about $5 billion. And we were using as many as 6 different information systems that touch upon the various aspects of these projects, ranging from scope to schedule to budget. And one slide I like to show is this kind of shows kind of our cost savings through maturity, where when we started this process back in 2012, we had 27 contractors that were using all that brute force that I described to pull data from multiple systems to be able to bring it into focus in a meaningful way. And as we've implemented this D2D platform, you can see how we've been able to reduce that level of effort, where right now we've been able to reduce it to 7 contractors, and as we go forward, we would expect to reduce the level of effort even further. So I think this shows that through advances in technology, we're able to reduce the effort and the resources required to have this picture. So that is an overview of how we're using data to better manage our work within the Public Building Service. At my old company, we used to have a saying that was, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think that's critically important for the work that we do at GSA. And when we talk about reducing the footprint, when we talk about improving our approach to leasing, when we talk about better management of our O&M dollars, to me it's all about talk is great, but what's the data that actually helps us demonstrate to ourselves that we're moving the needle in a positive way and making an impact. So I think that's what I wanted to cover this morning. I am happy to take any questions or talk more about the work that we're doing at the Public Building Service.
Yeah, hi, I'm Charlie Clark with Government Executive.
Hey, Charlie.
Yeah, you mentioned the notional 150 square feet per person. So, and then the agencies push back and have different cultures. So, how does that dovetail with the open office? You all are encouraging people to use the mobility and the teleworking to reduce office space.
Yeah. And
Can I ask you to repeat the question so that everybody can
sure.
hear?
So the question was, we talked about a notional space standard of 150 square feet per person, and how does that fit with the notion of open workspace? And I think part of it was agency receptivity to both concepts. You know, for us, this has been kind of an evolving and maturing process. I think one principle in our approach is it's not one size fits all. Another principle should be it's never an absolute. So let's just talk about the space utilization standard for a second. And that is, it is a goal. It is not a requirement. You may have field offices that have 3 people. It may make no business sense to try to cram everybody into 450 square feet. You may have swing space where you're going to be there for 6 months. It may make little business sense to try to bring everybody down when it's swing space and you're swinging people through constantly. Part of it is how do we use good judgment and common sense and not set rigid absolutes that drive people crazy. So, well, at the same time, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have any yardstick. So what we're trying to do is say, yeah, there needs to be a yardstick. That was step 1. 2 is, all right, our best thinking is 150, and if the agency doesn't have a space standard, that's what we'll fall back to. But let's allow the agency to define its own space standard. Because as I said, the work that they do at OMB or the work that they do at the National Labor Relations Board is very different than the work that they might do at the Department of Labor or the work that they do at DHS. So through this process, we're trying to focus on mission first, but to do so in a fiscally responsible way. And by allowing agencies to have a strong voice in defining their own space utilization standard, we think that goes a long way.
Norm, I'm formerly Director of Real Property Policy for GSA. We had to try to get utilization standards. Did you get a lot of pushback from the agencies trying to push them down to 150 square feet?
I would say it is evolving over time. So think about where the conversation is today relative to the conversation maybe 7 or 8 years ago. 7 or 8 years ago, budgets were increasing. And the conversation that you would have every year is how much of a budget increase am I going to get next year? When was the last time you had that conversation?
We did, but we tried to drive them down. We were always trying to be careful. But at one time, we tried 135 square feet per person, and there wasn't much circulation space. That went away. We tried to take it to about 180. This has gone back and forth for years, but you're on the right track.
So I think a couple things. One is there's a greater recognition today among all the agencies as nobody's talking about how much of an increase they're going to get. It really is, I hope I can keep my budget flat relative to last year. Flat is the new up in this budget environment. But given that fiscal environment that we're in, far greater receptivity, but I think where there's still a little bit of a disconnect is where you have the folks who make the decisions on how much space to use have to be talking to and have to be aligned with the people who are actually writing the check for that space. And if there's a disconnect, you're going to see some resistance. And where we've seen far greater receptivity is where you have a tenant agency where budget and facilities are working hand in hand on these issues, a lot of receptivity to the concept. We're back. Can I just add one more item real quick? There was a point in time where GSA was known as the space police. And I think there was a single number, I forget whether it was 122 square feet, and we're rigid and absolute in terms of applying that. That's not what we're about. It really is what I said about before. How do you meet the agency space requirement, but to do so in the most fiscally responsible way? And that has to allow for some flexibility in order to reflect agency mission.
Can I ask a follow-up, which is, you went from not having the data to counts of people, and then of course the next standard one would hope for perhaps is, well, let's get actual accurate data from an original source system, like the personnel system that will tell you how many employees and how many are full-time and what the head count is. Do you foresee that in the future, and if so, what are the kind of the hurdles that have to be overcome to get electronically collected data as opposed to just kind of hand counts?
For us, this is an evolving process, and we had conversations like that when we were struggling to figure out how to do this. And our simple thinking is, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. And we recognize that as we take more of a manual process, there may be issues where the data integrity may not be perfect, but it's a good running start. And someday we may get to the point where you can have a feed, but right now we think that it's time better spent just to kind of go with best effort as opposed to what would be perfect.
Mr. Boyle?
Question on the person to the number of individuals versus square feet. We go through this, seems like every year, if not every 6 months, about readjusting our personnel to the space available, which often leads to a lot of construction, which often leads to a lot of, my temperature doesn't work, it's either too hot, too cold, my light switch is in the next room type of thing. Is that a GSA concern, or is that generally a agency concern with respect to the final blueprints in that? Now, recognizing that there's in some respects you're driving guidance that says you should be looking at this sort of square footage, okay, and paying this amount, as opposed to accommodating the expansion of personnel that they're faced with and trying to cram those people into an already rigid construction. So the question is, how much do you control how the building is modified to accommodate that, as opposed to, and it's an internal agency issue problem, deal with it and take care of your people?
All right, I think that's a great question. It's not just about the size of the footprint, it's about the quality of the space. And at the end of the day, the space has to work for the tenant agency, and it helps to help them meet their mission. So again, we don't want to be so two-dimensional in our approach where we're just saying, okay, you meet the number here in terms of 50 or 175 or whatever we're applying as the relevant yardstick for that agency. But it really is, as we think about the work being done in that space, what are we doing in terms of planning and developing the program of requirements with those tenant agencies to figure out how you would fit out the space. So we think that's an equally important part of the question. And when we talked before about open workspace, we think a lot of agencies are embracing that concept. But again, agencies have different missions. And some agencies may need more private offices because they do more confidential work, they do more heads down work. So again, it's not a one size fits all, but I think the important element to your question is it's about developing the program of requirements in order to have the quality of the space.
Back?
Yeah, I think GSA, as the main landholder and lease for the government, has made an incredible effort to set the standard. But I'm curious to know that how you've adjusted your analytics in doing so, because you've reduced the footprint and your energy usage, but that's now being borne in part by your employees who are teleworking. And that's going on throughout every agency as an increase, but I'm wondering how much of those analytical results are truly accurate in how much energy is being used or saved, and maybe it's none. How are you adjusting for that?
So I think there are multiple elements to your question. Part of it is you're right in terms of, all right, if folks are doing more teleworking, then while you may have reduced energy consumption figures at 1800 F Street, how are you factoring in energy increase at Mary Smith's home where she's teleworking 3 days a week. I think that's one element of your question. And you're right, we don't have great ways of capturing that information. But I think it comes back to the strong narrative that we're able to reduce our rent spend and we're able to reduce our energy consumption. And I would be surprised if it's a one-for-one corresponding increase back at everyone's house. So I do think that there's a strong narrative in terms of what you're able to save as you reduce your footprint. So for example, at 1800 F Street, we're saving about $25 million each year, having consolidated multiple leases in the National Capital Region into that building. And that building is still not fully utilized. We have additional capacity to absorb more people in the headquarters building. I think the other point that you talked about was, the impact on the ability to achieve mission. And all right, what are we doing if we dramatically reduce the space so much and folks feel that they have to telework? Are we compromising mission in a different way? And I would say it's all about a balancing act. And it's not about, okay, get the footprint as small as possible. It really is, what's the nature of the work that we do in this agency? Given the nature of the work that we do, how would we design the space? What do we need in terms of a footprint? And again, I said before, it's not one size fits all. Different agencies, different requirements would dictate different types of space design. But it really is, we know that there's opportunity, by doing that type of analysis before where we're collecting information and we have much better visibility in terms of how the space is being used. We see some tenants that have 350 square feet per person. And the question is, that's a lot of space. And you think about, where the natural trends in terms of mobility and telework, when I go to some of these facilities, it's like a ghost town. You hear crickets chirping because, people are teleworking, they've got AWS. I remember, I'll use another FEMA example. I went up to the Boston office. We had 2 floors at 99 High Street. I went on a Friday morning, probably about 20% of the workstations were filled. 80% were vacant. So I think part of it is having the data allows us to better identify where there are opportunities to reduce the footprint, but it's a balancing act where as we do this, let's not lose sight of agency mission, and that should be first and foremost as we think about the work that we're doing.
We had a question from a student online, and the question was, there may be some tension a little bit occasionally, perhaps between GSA and agencies. And the question is, and to some extent, how do you use analytics and what other ways do you foster cooperation and kind of resolve tension between GSA and agencies? How big a role does analytics play?
We have a program called our Client Portfolio Program, where we look at how an agency is using its space, and we identify opportunities for co-location and consolidation and reducing the footprint. And what really makes that process work is having it be a dialogue. It's not GSA doing independent analytics and forcing it on the agency saying, reduce your footprint. But it really is kind of looking at how the space is being used, but then also looking at opportunities on the horizon. This is not about, all right, you're in space right now. Let's say you're in space and the lease doesn't expire for 5 years. I'm not going to upend everybody and dramatically shrink the space. What we want to do is to look at those opportunities on the horizon where your lease is expiring. So if you're going to have to do a competition anyway and you've got 350 square feet per person, when we have to do that next competition, why don't we scope it down to like 175? So part of it is disruption. We're not trying to disrupt people in place where they have leases that will go on for a number of years. It really is, as you look at your upcoming lease expirations, what are we doing to think about what that relevant yardstick should be for the agency? How are we planning the space requirement together so it's not one size fits all, but it really is speaking to the agency requirements? And then how are we using that next transaction to reduce the footprint and to improve the quality of the space? So part of the headline really is, it's all about collaboration and dialogue with the agency as opposed to this is what GSA thinks, you must do it.
Lisa?
Two more questions. The first one is a follow-up to Jeff's question, which is, how do you have an idea or imagine how your use and need for technology will begin to evolve from where you do it now with a more manual process? So you said it's easier and better, and perfect's not the enemy of good by, getting staff to pull data together today. How do you imagine, or do you imagine, that arc will eventually mature to one where more technology will be used to collect that information? That's part one. The other one is
All
smaller
right, so
question.
start with part one first?
Start with part one, please.
All right, so I'm going to make a confession here. I am not a technology person. I am not a technologist. When people start talking about technology stuff, I kind of goes over my head. I am more of a business process person. So to me, I start with the business process. And I think sometimes we often play the technology card in terms of, I need a new system to fix it. And my pushback to them will be, all right, you don't have the money for a new system. What's your workaround? What are you going to do to figure out the problem? So I think it really starts with a more fundamental question for me in terms of what's the problem we're trying to solve. Tell me how the business process should work, and then tell me how the technology would support that. So I think if you approach it that way, it's a much more logical way of thinking about how technology enables the business process, as opposed to technology has now become the silver bullet.
Absolutely. I just meant in terms of the analytics that you find that you'll need to support that very process. Do you see technology needing an evolution to need that for your analytics, or not yet? You don't see that on the horizon?
Greg, what are your thoughts? You're smarter about this than I am.
So I think that what we see is we have lots of systems that collect a lot of data, and you can get that data out of the system, and we need to be making those links on how to tie it all together. A lot of systems have been created for a lot of good reasons over many years, and now we're at a point where we need to start linking it, needs to start talking to each other. We've been burning people, a lot of people, and a lot of contract dollars in order to do that. And with that last slide showing the data to decisions and that giant map, that's a perfect example of us getting the information out of the systems into a common platform. We've made the connections, and now let's see what the data tells us, from all the way at the end of the spectrum to the building manager, all the way up to the commissioner.
That's great.
Wyatt, and then we have another OMalley.
Yeah, Wyatt Cash with FedScoop. You mentioned there's 27 million data points. Can you talk about what you're doing to get more sensors and more data automatically helping you collect this data? And are you negotiating with the utilities or the construction companies to make this part of the renovations? How are you investing to get more data inputs as you go forward?
I mentioned that we had GSA Link, we had 81 buildings on GSA Link, and our focus is really kind of expanding that. There was an initial investment required to get those 81 buildings online. The question is, all right, what's that next set that we want to bring online as well, and then be able to plan the resources accordingly. So, there's our plan to go beyond the initial 81 that we've talked about, and we've got to be able to make sure that we're resourcing that accordingly.
Does GSA invest in those sensors, or are you negotiating? How would you plan to expand the number of sensors for data input or daily reports? Do you work on energy audits?
So that is it, right? It's not the need for investing in additional sensors. The sensors are there. As Mr. Don was saying, once GSA gets GSA linked to those sensors, there's a lot of data already available. It's connecting the data points.
I'd actually like to ask a follow-up, which is the question about kind of how much money to spend on analytics. And it's hard to tell because it's hard to tell what the payoff is. But it seems like you've got some examples. You showed one where we turned off the utilities on New Year's Day, whereas we'd had them on December 26th, and we saved a bunch of money. So I guess the question is eventually, is GSA doing something to say, well, how much money has GSA Link saved us in utility bills or other things? in order to then be able to say, well, let's spend some money on sensors or let's spend some money on analysts?
I think the lesson learned through this experience is that the investment is paying off, whether it's through GSA Link or whether it's through the investments in technology that have enabled the analytics that we've reviewed here today. So I think there is a strong case to be made in terms of, you know, the upfront costs of investing in the technology or the staffing to support the analytics is playing out in terms of reduced costs.
Yeah, we had a question online from a person at the National Institutes of Health who says, 150 square foot standard include common space, and what about unusual uses like laboratories?
All right, everybody's so focused on the space utilization. I thought this would be the least interesting part of the presentation. I'm actually quite pleased that there's so much focus and energy on this. The 150, again, was notional, and I used it as an illustrative example. And the headline here, particularly as we go into fiscal year 16, really is it's all about the agency space standards. So, for example, DHS has defined 150 square feet all in as the standard that they would manage to. And again, I would say goal, not a requirement, and I think everyone would recognize that you always want to leave some flexibility to be able to deal with specific circumstances, but as a general rule, you want to have some yardstick that you're measuring. So it really is looking to the agencies in terms of how they've defined that standard, as opposed to GSA is now imposing its own standard.
Regarding the sensors, I'm John Van Sant from the Government Publishing Office. Regarding the sensor process, do you see the investment being sort of a forward-looking acquisition of assets that are configured for these more modern systems to generate the analytics, as compared to a retrofitting the legacy installed buildings, some of which are relatively old and might be somewhat more difficult to create sensors in? So it's a ever-increasing number of buildings that are capable of performing these sensor operations and some of the autonomous management of the buildings. By going forward in time and acquiring them, replacing older ones with newer ones that are built that way? Or do you see the GSA and other agencies who are not using GSA buildings having an obligation, particularly for some of the historic buildings, to consider putting those things in if they're cost effective for their mission?
I'm not sure I follow.
The sensors aren't free.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can either buy 81 buildings that are industry built with sensors, because that's what commercial real estate is doing to attract their tenants and show that and give them very cost-effective ways to manage their building. Alternatively, you can take the buildings you've got, install sensors all over them, create systems. A lot of buildings don't have them. Our building, for instance, does not have sensor systems. It would be very expensive for us to do that. We'd really love to reap the benefits of that, but it's a big barrier when you look at the legacy buildings to say, how do we go back and do these things? Some of the things aren't zoned for, HVAC controls. They don't have individual office controls. A lot of it's just manual stuff, or a person in the building management system saying, let's make building 3 warmer.
So you're saying that there may be certain buildings where it's cost prohibitive to do this, so we just
I'm assuming
put
that's
those
the case.
aside?
I'm looking for the way GSA looks at this. You said you have 81 buildings. When you go through your next one, is it going to be primarily through, you had a chart of new, redoing releases, acquiring new space. Do you acquire new space with an eye towards this more modern way of managing buildings? It's a criteria and the requirements for the contract, and that's how you move into more buildings that are managed?
I think when we look at our own portfolio and ask, all right, how are we going to identify that next set of buildings for expansion, I think part of it factors in the economic analysis that you've talked about in terms of, all right, is it going to be so prohibitive to do it here? Maybe we move on to the next one. So I think the economic analysis that you mentioned is an important part of the decision making in terms of where we go next.
Sir?
When you're looking at a system like the D2D system, where you're bringing data in from a variety of sources, some of which I assume are legacy systems, some are newer, Can you say something about how you approach data governance and data standardization? Is that something that receives attention at an enterprise level? Are you building or constructing a comprehensive data schema, or is this something that's being done on a very case-by-case basis? It's issue of data governance and data standardization.
Gee, I think you're asking the wrong person that question. We've got a CIO staff that manages this whole activity and a group focused specifically on this process. When we talk about data governance and data standards, my expectation is that very much is part of the process.
Norm, could we maybe, I saw Andre Chersoff's hand go up, and I know he actually works
Oh yeah,
with that.
Andre's here. You can answer that question.
I can add a little bit. So I'm Andre Chersoff with the Office of the Administrator at GSA, and so to answer your question, it's actually a fairly lightweight governance process. We have a cross-functional steering committee that runs the D2D project overall. There is again a cross-functional enterprise level working group that runs through this process, and actually Greg is a member of that team. The approach we are taking is actually to stay away from designing master schemas or master data dictionaries for agency as a whole. We actually are taking the opposite approach of saying, let's migrate certain data sets that are really key for PBS, for example. So we brought several data sets into the cloud. And we are saying, let's test as many possible analytical tools as we can in a sort of interchangeable fashion. So the overall paradigm shift is we're moving away from things like SAP and business objects and the reporting modules that are on top of a big, massive system. Right. We're saying, let's bring stuff into the cloud, let's bring different systems into the cloud, let's bring lightweight tools and an array of them like STI and Jasper and MicroStrategy and Tableau, and see what our designers can actually do by linking those tools and pinning the various systems and writing the scripts in a way that actually integrate across systems. So for example, the report that Norm showed is actually quite cool because it has unstructured data, it has text data, it has actual numerical variables, it has variables for 15 years for certain parameters, for 10 years for certain other parameters, and all of that was coded and meshed together for fairly lightweight tools in a cost-effective fashion.
I actually like.
Thanks, Andre. I was going to give that same exact answer.
I'd actually like to jump in for just a minute, step out of my facilitating role. This is actually a very good practice. And in fact, one of the reasons that we invited Norman was to give kind of the perspective on what does a senior executive want from analysis. And they don't necessarily want everything under the sun. So the tendency some agencies have is to kind of boil the ocean and try to bring all the data together and figure out how to map all of it. And it takes forever and often fails. And instead, this kind of lightweight process that Andre is describing brings together the information that the executive wants and uses and gets some feedback and says, okay, well, that wasn't enough, we might need this other piece, but we don't need everything. And so that's actually something that REI is seeing happen more and more often across government, of kind of just demand responsive data and analytics. And it's a lot cheaper too, frankly. Yes, Mr. Moore.
A question that was brought up before about legacy buildings and the cost and technology. Does any negotiating between GSA and the agency, for example, to provide upgrade technology, particularly in older buildings, simple things like halogen lighting versus fluorescent versus incandescent, smart switches, whatever it is, or is the agency on its own if it's going through a revamp of its space to either make use of what's there or they're on their own? But is there any discussion, any incentive?
I don't think the agency's on their own, and GSA tries to be at the forefront in terms of using advanced technology to reduce our energy consumption. We have a program called Green Proving Ground, where we work with industry to identify emerging technologies that we will put in our buildings and that are demonstrated to have an impact in terms of performance and cost. And every year we recognize emerging technologies through the Green Proving Ground program, and we introduce new technologies. So whether it is shades that we have in 1800 F Street that go up or down based on the temperature and the amount of light coming into the building, or whether it is our lighting in our conference rooms where it's hooked up to our bucket system. So if I've got a meeting in one of my conference rooms from 9 to 10. At 5 minutes to 10, we'll get a flash, the lights will blink, and at 10 o'clock, the lights will go off. So we've linked the conference room booking system to a lighting system to be able to make sure that we're maximizing our efficiency as it relates there. So a whole host of building technologies that we've introduced within our federal buildings portfolio, and we see it as our responsibility, not the agency's responsibility, to be able to manage that program and to make sure that we're being aggressive on this question and not simply saying, okay, agencies, you're on your own.
So this actually brings up to my mind a question, Norman, which is that the analytics that you shared, and I'm thinking again, for example, of we turned the utilities down on New Year's because we learned something. My guess is with a geographically dispersed portfolio, you've got a lot of different people, some agencies, some GSA staff learning things. You're finding some of them through analytics. How do the people who kind of learn something share that with peers in a dispersed geography? And especially where you learn something from analytics, how do you get that information out to folks who could take advantage of it more broadly?
We have 11 different regions, and one of the sayings that I've heard, probably too much now, is we have 11 different regions doing things 11 different ways. And for me, it's about having much more operating discipline across the geography within PBS. And that underscores the role of the assistant commissioner at headquarters, where in the past their view has been more policy oriented, where they issue the policy and someone else is responsible for the operations. What I've said to each of my assistant commissioners is, you're running the line of business. You may not be doing the day-to-day operations, but you are responsible for the operational outcomes. It's a very different model than what the agency had been used to in the past. And part of that responsibility is to make sure that we have that operational discipline in everything that we do, whether it's portfolio management, whether it's leasing, whether it's facilities management. So it's a much more forward-leaning role that really gets much more into the operations of PBS as opposed to the policy role that they had played in the past. And part of that is to make sure that if we've got a good idea in Region 1 that we should be embracing more broadly, guess what? We're going to embrace it more broadly and apply it across the landscape.
So I have one last question, then we'll wrap up. We've heard a lot about kind of the analytics that you've been using, and my question is about, are there places where you want to use predictive analytics, things that you would like to have that you don't have yet? Kind of what might be next in your aspiration?
I will talk about areas where we still struggle. One is on leasing, where I talked about before, and the whole notion of being far more disciplined in terms of our planning and being able to get agency requirements timely so that we can take a competitive approach. How predictive analytics factors into that, I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet, but that is something that's still kind of an operational challenge for us. In the building O&M space, I still think that there's more opportunity to identify additional savings. So if we look at the sustainability or executive order that came out a few months ago, it's raising the bar in terms of further energy savings that are required. We've done a great job in terms of reducing our energy consumption by 30% relative to 2003 levels. But now the bar has been raised even further. So the question is, all right, is there an opportunity to use predictive analytics in that space to think through where the next opportunities are? Because I think we've gotten a lot of good results, but what I'm hearing from the field is that, all right, we've squeezed a lot of juice out of this lemon, where do we go next?
Great. If there are other questions, thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation, Norman, and we appreciate your coming as part of the audience.